Wow.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Four more people
Yes.
in the waiting room.
Let a few more people in before we get started. All right, I think it's 11:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to week 5 of the Western Mass Housing Conference. It's a 7-week series, so we're getting to the end, and thank you everyone who's joined us. If you missed any of the sessions this far, we have them on the Housing Toolbox website. We've been recording all of them and they're posted there. I can send a link later. So yeah, just a few housekeeping items before I pass it over to my colleague, Katie Lacey. We will be recording this today, like I mentioned, and we'll be saving questions to the end. Lorin, Laura, and Paul have a lot of great info to share with us today, so we'd like to get through it. And if anything comes up along the way, just post it in the chat, and Katie will be kind of monitoring that to field those questions out. And I think that's it. So with that, I'll pass it over to Katie.
To unmute myself. Good morning. This is a session on senior housing, which is, a hot topic wherever we go in the community assistance team. I thought I'd just say a few words. We could just look at a few slides about MHP. Those of you who've been with us since the beginning, this is us, this is what we do. We focus on increasing the supply of affordable housing in the state, and our team, Community Assistance, really works closely with municipalities on how the challenges they're facing and how they want to address those. So today, again, the issue of senior housing has come up again and again for us. I was involved with the rural policy plan, and it's a big issue. It's identified as a top issue in that plan, sort of the need for senior housing. And what we hear again and again is people would like to have their seniors in their community. And we know that's super challenging and can't always be done. So today we have a really great panel. We have Laura Baker, the real estate project manager at Valley Community Development, and she'll be joined by Lorin Starr of the 120 North Main Street Committee in Sunderland, and Paul Lischetti, who is the housing director at Hilltown CDC. And they're going to be talking about 2 senior projects that they worked on in Western Mass. So go ahead, I'll turn it over to Laura.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to start sharing screen at this point. Bear with me. Okay, can folks see that beginning slide there? Great. So we've titled this Bringing Senior Housing to Small and Rural Towns. This happens to be an image here of the Goshen Senior Housing Project, which we'll talk about a bit more as we go through the slides. My name is Laura Baker. I'm the real estate project manager at Valley Community Development. I have more than 25 years experience in community development, and I've worked on several rural affordable senior housing developments that range in size from 7 apartments to 33 apartments. And Lorin.
I'm Lorin Starr. I live in Sunderland, Massachusetts, which is near Amherst, for those of you who aren't from Western Mass. I've lived here for 30 years, which means I'm a newcomer. but I've been quite involved in the town since I've been here. I am still chair of the 120 North Main Street Committee, dedicated to developing affordable senior housing. I'm the vice chair of the Board of Library Trustees that I've been on since 1996, and I was chair of the building committee when we built a new building in 2004. My background is in interior design. I have my own practice in Amherst, and I'm also executive director of the Western Mass chapter of the American Institute of Architects.
Thank you, Lorin. And Paul.
So I've been the housing director at Hilltown CDC since 2006. I moved to Western Mass in 1987 with a prior background in construction. Since 1987, I've been working in the community development field. I worked at Nueva Esperanza in Holyoke. I worked at the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission in the Community Development Department. I was the director of the Westfield CDC for 4 or 5 years. And while I was at Nueva Esperanza, I was the founding director of the Holyoke Community Land Trust. And somewhere in there, I also picked up a few years of experience in construction work and with a kind of a specialty in energy conservation. I managed the development of Westhampton Woods Senior Housing Phase 2 and Goshen Senior Housing, which the community has named Highland Village Circle, so we still call it both. So that's a brief resume there.
Great, thank you, Paul. So we're going to do a quick poll just to help us understand who's in our midst, and Katie will be managing the poll.
Yes, I'll launch that now.
Can
There
folks
is 4
see the
questions.
poll? I can.
Right, it's almost complete, Laura. A few more seconds. All right, I think we have everyone who wanted to fill out the poll, so I'll go ahead and end it and share the results. Everyone can see.
So a range of types of folks, most commonly planners. Trending into the senior years, those of us who are participating. Almost everybody believes that affordable senior housing is needed in their community, 96%. Oh, but only 18% would be qualified, interested, and ready to move into affordable senior housing in their home community were it to be available in the coming year. So one of the reasons we did this poll was just kind of to see who was joining us today. Some of these results are things that we see replicated as we work on affordable senior housing, which is that the interested parties often are seniors or pre-seniors. That when we survey communities, almost everybody thinks affordable senior housing is a great idea. Almost everybody thinks it's needed. And then there is a much smaller subset of folks who would be qualified and ready to move in. And so it's a really important distinction if you're in a community where one of your tools is a community survey, to just be able to understand the difference between kind of support and actual housing demand. So can I close this out? There we go. So we're going to head into the presentation now. We're going to talk about why senior housing matters in small and rural towns. You know, some folks at the state level would say, you know, the solution to senior housing is to regionalize it in larger communities. But there's some reasons why that might not be the best approach. So most of the towns we look at in rural Western Mass have an aging population. Many don't have a lot of viable options for seniors that might be present in more urban areas. So they may have no dedicated stock. They may not have much rental stock. They may have few or no condo options, and they may not have a type of housing stock that's handicapped accessible. What we've heard is seniors want to remain near their family and they want to stay in their home communities as long as possible. And what we know, those of us who live in small New England towns, is the older residents have traditionally been the backbone of volunteer governance and services in small towns. And so when you start to lose those residents, it ripples through your community. Some of the key features that have to do with small and rural affordable housing development that have a big impact on potential and scale are the following. One of the big challenges I've faced as a developer is the fact that most very small towns don't have public water or sewer, which is a fairly enormous challenge. It means you're either doing a private sewer system, and you really are limited based on the soils that you have and how much sewage you can treat on a given site. And you also have ongoing costs to maintain a private sewer system. Water is also a big challenge. You can drill a well, and if your well serves more than 24 persons on a regular basis, you need to meet standards for a public water supply. So these include having a large land area buffer zone around it and doing regular water testing. So it's a pretty high standard to meet to have a private water supply, and you need significant amount of land area to be able to do that. Other challenges and features are land use limitations. So in rural towns, often we see conservation restrictions, we see agricultural land, riverfront, wetlands, ledge, steep slopes. You know, what people say about New England is all the best sites were built out over 100 years ago, and all the mediocre sites were built out 50 years ago, and everything that's left probably has some sort of development challenge associated with it. The zoning that has come to exist in most small and rural towns best serves the type of housing that's there, which is single family detached housing. That's what it reflects. In many, many cases, it does not permit any kind of multi-use development. So therefore, most affordable housing development in rural towns will fall under the state's comprehensive 40B statute, which allows a developer to request waivers from any local zoning bylaw or regulation, including those related to density. It's a long and sometimes controversial process to permit a project in this way. The local market for senior housing in rural areas I find to be different than it might be in cities. Urban seniors may already live in an apartment and might be looking for a more affordable or handicapped accessible apartment, whereas rural seniors tend to be living in their own home. And they typically need to sell this home in order to move into senior housing. So it's a whole process. It can be a long and daunting process for people to go through. Most have paid off their mortgage, so their monthly housing cost is actually quite low. And the rental units need to be priced so that the incoming rural seniors don't have sticker shock when they compare their zero mortgage. Of course, they have, you know, taxes and utilities and insurance to the cost of rental housing. And then in general, rural areas typically have lower market rents. And so again, from a development perspective, it's more challenging to have sufficient funds to operate these properties because the rents are low compared to urban areas in Massachusetts. There is an advantage that we find in small and rural towns, which is that in Massachusetts, most of these towns fall short of meeting the state's goal of having 10% of their units on the subsidized housing inventory, which is a measure that the state devised for trying to mark how much affordable, permanently protected or regulated affordable housing exists in a town. When this is true, then there's a presumption in favor of the developer that affordable housing is needed. So the 40B process there can be an advantage to being in a small town that has not met its 10% goal. So we're going to talk about some of the main ingredients that we see for being successful in affordable housing development in small and rural towns. Number one, and I put it in order intentionally, is site and location. Number two, having local champions. Number three, having a viable scale. Number four, having an interested developer who has capacity to develop in your town. And number five, having a realistic timeline and a lot of tenacity and gumption. So we're going to go through these one by one. My opinion is the single most important factor in success for affordable senior housing is site and location. That the site should be ideally central and easily accessible, and it should be buildable. And again, in rural areas, that has a very specific meaning in terms of the ability to support water and sewer. Should be connected to public water and sewer or able to support private systems. It must make sense to Boston funders. So what I've seen sometimes is seniors living in rural towns actually really like a wooded location. But when we have funders come out from Boston, it doesn't make sense to them to put senior housing in the woods down a dirt road. The price of the property itself must be reasonable and the site must be available and have a patient seller. It takes a long time to be successful at developing affordable senior housing in small towns. And so a lot of communities I've seen spin their wheels over many years talking about sites that they would love to have, but that are not available for one reason or another. Often it's a seller who just won't sell. The timing isn't right for them to sell. And so I really would encourage people not to chase sites that are not actually available, including municipal sites that might seem inexpensive, but might not be in the long run. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. So one of the key factors having to do with site is something called site control. Site control is a critical step in housing development, but people don't necessarily, it's not ownership. So it means that a buyer has an exclusive right to purchase a property. So examples of site control include actual ownership, having a long-term lease or an agreement for a long-term lease, having a purchase and sales agreement, having an option to purchase agreement, or being identified by a municipality as a preferred developer for a site. So it's not necessary to own the site, but it's very important to have site control over a site before investing money in the planning and pre-development stage. So without having site control, the developer's money spent for planning is at risk, since the seller wouldn't have to sell to this developer. They could sell to somebody else or change their mind and decide not to sell at all. There are loan funds in Massachusetts that are specially set up for developers to use for pre-development financing. They will not lend to us until we have site control. A developer's right to conduct tests, which is always essential. Perk tests, soil tests, that kind of thing on the property may be limited without site control. And a developer cannot seek this 40B comprehensive permit without site control. And the developer cannot apply for state resources without site control. So I always think about kind of the project getting real at the point when there's site control. And again, it doesn't mean anybody's purchased anything, but there is a written agreement that means that if the developer decides to pursue the project, the site is guaranteed to be available at a particular price. So locating a site in rural areas, I have found extremely challenging. people think about rural towns and you look at a map and you think there's just land everywhere. But what is not everywhere are roads. And so the amount of property with frontage is fairly small in rural areas. So this is an example from Goshen Senior Housing that reflects how this town committee, their efforts to find a site. So in this case, we've color coded it here. The blue are inquiries made on different parcels. The red are site visits made by this committee to see these different sites. And the green ones are 3 sites that the committee decided were the best ones and where they had some planning money to spend doing site feasibility work. So we actually did perk tests and did little, exercises in site planning on the sites that are in green here. In the end, none of these sites were used for Goshen Senior Housing. This is the site, and this is the built project. So what I would say in terms of location for this particular project is this is what I would be looking for. So here is the town center. Goshen is a town of 1,100, 1,200 people, very small, very rural, no public water, no public sewer. The town center is essentially 2 roads meet. There's a church, there's a town hall, there's a library, there's a post office, there's a small general store, and that's pretty much the center of Goshen. So we were extremely fortunate to pick up land that is directly in this town center. And what got built here are a total of 10 units, 4 here, 4 here, and 2 here, with a kind of a little common here. This property was connected to the church. It was the home of the parsonage. Parsonage was a relatively modest, not historic house that was able to be demolished in order to develop this property. The church wanted to sell because they needed the cash for a new roof for the church. So that is how this particular project was developed. In Sunderland, we're going to talk quite a bit about a Sunderland senior housing project that is about to go under construction. Again, you'll see the proximity. This is the town center, roughly, of Sunderland, 2 roads cross. This is the project site. And so here you have the town offices, this is the library, this is the municipal park, a couple of restaurants here, there's bank over here, church here, corner store here. So again, this is the metropolis center of Sunderland. And this project site is within a few hundred feet of these various amenities that are here in Sunderland. In both the case of Goshen and Sunderland, you're on a major transit route. So this is Route 47, up in Goshen, it's Route 9. So it's a well-traveled route. Goshen does not have any regular bus service. Sunderland does, and there's some bus stops that are nearby. The next piece that we wanted to talk about was the how critical it is for local volunteers to be involved and basically be champions for affordable senior housing in their town. So we find that these people are often seniors or pre-seniors. They're often folks that are active already in local government, in the church or other community groups, and they're often local leaders. And what they do is they shepherd the process, they rally local support, they turn out residents to advocate or vote, and they make senior housing an important agenda in their community. They grab hold and do not let go because it is a long process. Without this, I have seen towns talk about senior housing for a long time, but not actually get a project underway. So we're going to give some examples of projects that had strong local champions and how those local champions, what they did to help their projects kind of get going. So I'm going to turn it over to Lorin.
Sorry. So in Sunderland, we had a site, as Laura showed you, in the center of town. And I think what might not have been apparent on that slide is the site, which is on North Main Street, is actually quite a historic street with a expanse of houses that are very sort of deliberately placed with a rhythm going down the street. So in 2014, the town kind of went out on a limb and bought the property at 120 North Main. The selectmen were very keen on developing affordable senior housing there. And honestly, no one knew whether it was viable. And so we bought the property and they said, Lorin, why don't you see if this will work? So they appointed a committee, and I have to say that I would agree that I think it's a very long process. You do have to be extremely tenacious. We had a committee. The committee should not necessarily be all people who are supportive. We had a committee originally of 8, I think, and ultimately of 7 people. 3 of them were abutters. Couple of them probably not gung-ho at the beginning, and we went through a very deliberate process, which we were fortunate. We had some grant money to do both a site feasibility study, which we did first, working with the Berkshire Design Group, and then a market study. And those steps were very important, not only because you sort of need that information to get a developer on board, but also very methodically, I think, put the committee and then the town through kind of visioning what are the options here. And this was not a simple project. The Historic Commission was quite adamant that we keep the house and then develop the site to the rear. We started out thinking that we might do individual units, and finally realized that the only way to make it work was with a kind of larger building. And that took us a couple of years before we got to the point of getting an RFP out at the end of 2016. And in fact, when we issued the RFP, the response we got was actually proposed something a little different than what we had envisioned. We had several town meeting votes. I mean, every one, you had to be very deliberate, a lot of community meetings. And again, I think the committee really came around and became very strong champions of the project. And I think another very important aspect to appointing a committee is that they have different constituencies in town, so that you're not just only preaching to a small group of people. I think you get a lot more legitimacy when you see who's involved and who's supporting it, and that it's not just the usual suspects. So I can say that here we are 6 years into it. The project has been permitted. Rural Development is the developer. And I can't get this committee to step down. We were reappointed because everyone really wants to see it through to the end, even though at this point, all we really are doing is helping shepherd it through and answering questions. I'd also say that it's very, if you get a good developer and you have a good architect, you have a strong project, you're in good hands.
Great, thank you, Lorin. We're going to move to Paul, talking briefly about the Goshen Senior Housing Development.
So it started, I would say, in 2007 when Hilltown CDC conducted an elder housing needs survey in the Hilltown area. And there was a local citizen who had been very active in the town for a long time, had been on the CDC board, and had been involved in seeing through the development of a building for the ambulance service. And he, with support from others in the town, asked the select board to appoint a study committee, which they did. The select board appointed the Goshen Elder Housing Study Committee in 2010 and invited Hilltown CDC to attend its meetings. Just to go along with this slide, who did the work? The town appointed the Elder Housing Study Committee, adopted the Community Preservation Act so that local funds would be available for affordable housing. And ultimately that committee provided some funding, Community Preservation Act funds for the project. Another thing the town did, the Zoning Board of Appeals granted a comprehensive permit for the project. Hilltown CDC was involved in the pre-development work with guidance and support from the Elder Housing Study Committee and the CPA Committee. The Zoning Board of Appeals, the Board of Selectmen, the Conservation Commission, all cooperated in the process. But the question of who were the heroes, the support of the Elder Housing Study Committee, which later just became the Elder Housing Committee, was really critical. That committee was the same group of people for 8 years. They met monthly for 8 years to see the project through, from early years when they were just kind of trying to figure out what could be done. And then, eventually funding was received for a planning study, and they worked with the consultants who were doing the planning study, and then sort of were present. The chair of that committee was present at job meetings all the way through the project with the contractor and the architect, just kind of saying, well, wait, we really were hoping it would look like this or whatever. But having that kind of support is kind of what drives Hilltown CDC, at least as a developer, because a project, a 10-unit project in Goshen is not something that market forces would, deliver. The CDC is driven by its mission to meet an identified need and develop affordable housing, but also by the relentless support of the committee. And that committee was needed every step of the way to show up at public hearings, appeal to the Board of Selectmen and other community boards, and build support within the community. And there's a slide later about timeline, and I can talk a little bit about what all those steps were.
Yep.
But I have to say that, lots of towns kind of say, oh yeah, we really want senior housing, and they might even appoint a committee, but if the committee is just kind of pro forma, like, oh yeah, the select board selected us to investigate this issue, if there aren't real champions on that committee who are going to stick with it through thick and thin, it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah, these are working committees, and in the case of Goshen, I used to joke that the committee was aging in place because they just stuck with it. The chair of the committee would just show up at select board meetings just to tell them what was happening. I mean, it was a working group. So it's vital to kind of making a good fit in your town. And both of these projects, Sunderland and Goshen, there were people who didn't want them to happen, whether they were abutters or other community members. So you don't want the developer to be the one riding in from outside and saying, you should do this. You want local folks who can be the mouthpiece for what the local needs are. Viable scale is a huge topic for any of us working in small towns or rural areas when it comes to a lot of services, including affordable housing. So we're going to talk a bit about how the number of housing units impacts feasibility. So on the development side, which is the building of the project, it affects how much money you can access and what types of programs. It affects the ability to pay for common areas. People tend to fund units of affordable housing. They don't fund a common room or a fitness room or a library. So those, if you want common areas in your development, it has to be big enough to carry those costs. Fixed costs, the acquisition of land and things like that. If you only have 2 units, land is very expensive. If you have 20 units, that acquisition cost is less per unit. We sometimes see towns wanting to put a toe in the water where they will do a first phase of senior housing and then think another phase will come later. And we are concerned when we see that because it is a tremendous amount of work and time to get this stuff built. So we would recommend when people are looking at properties and looking at needs, a more once and done approach is strongly preferred. During operations, the number of units and the revenue from the property affect how sustainable the operations are. Are you able to break even? Can you pay for on-site staff or supportive services, which is a hot topic for senior housing? The state is really looking for developers to come in with proposals that include services for seniors. The ability to cover fixed costs, such as the annual cost to maintain an elevator, and the ability to pay for capital repairs. So what none of us want is a project that's so skinny in its financing that it can't make adequate repairs and starts to fall into disrepair over time. So Sunderland, Lorin referenced this a little bit, was, and maybe I'll turn it back to you, Lorin, is the kind of difference between what the town asked for and what they got.
So when we submitted the RFP, we were looking at a proposal for 18 units. If those of you from the eastern part of the state might think that's small, but that seemed rather, good size to us. But as I said, it was a difficult site. We knew that there were a lot of challenges, primarily financial challenges to having it developed. And, I think one thing that's hard to even make clear in your town is that it's kind of like, yeah, we have this great idea, but now we need someone who's actually going to do it. They're going to do it. They're going to pay for it. They're going to build it and they're going to run it. It's not really our project. And so you kind of have to be a little flexible. We only got one proposal. It was for substantially more units. I think we're down to 33 now, but the proposal came in at 34. And what I think was impressive about the proposal was that it very clearly kind of showed how we can not really make a very big difference in terms of the impact on the site and on the neighborhood. Again, we're inserting this in a single family residential neighborhood. And while I would say in general, the town was very supportive of affordable senior housing, there was a little concern and a lot of neighbors. And, we were concerned, that we were putting this in basically in people's backyard. But I think it was done in really such a careful way and so much in line with what the kind of proposal had asked for, and was quite convincing that our committee was rather impressed. And when we brought it back to the selectmen, it was accepted. And so it was kind of a bold proposal, I'd have to say, to kind of suggest something that wasn't really what was asked for. But I think it wound up a good conversation, and we were very committed to wanting to create the housing. In some ways, having more units meant we were serving more people, and we felt that it was being done in a way that really wasn't having additional impact on the site. So we were willing to accept it.
Thank you, Lorin.
Someone's asking what the population of Sunderland is, and I think we're just under 3,000.
Really?
Giant compared to Goshen. So cost is a driving theme in the development, in construction these days in general, but especially for affordable housing. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it really costs to build affordable housing, also known as why is it so expensive? So sometimes people hear the word affordable housing and it is affordable to the end users, and people assume that it will be inexpensive also to build. And statistically, this is not the case at all. Currently in Massachusetts, affordable housing development typically costs between $350,000 to $490,000 per unit, depending upon type and location. And if you're in the Eastern Mass area, maybe those numbers aren't quite as shocking, but they're pretty shocking out in Western Mass. People go, for a one-bedroom apartment, why would it cost this amount of money? So factors that drive up that cost include the legal complexity, which is great, high standards for handicapped accessibility, high standards for energy efficiency, the required reserves that funders want to see in these properties, the cost and time associated with using multiple funding sources, and lately just the rampant inflation in construction costs. Unless you're in the building trades, you may not be aware of just how expensive construction is currently. And, steadily, no matter what the economy does, it seems like construction costs keep inflating. Most affordable housing development projects will use anywhere between 6 to 12 different funding sources. So when I talk about complexity and legal issues, that's one of the drivers, is that for better or worse, we've set up a system in Massachusetts, even though there's a consolidated funding round, we're still pulling money from all these different pots because so much is needed in order to develop these projects. So who pays for it? Because it's a lot of money. The largest single source, it's true in Massachusetts and nationally, is the Federal Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. This is actually private equity invested through an IRS program. It's not through housing and urban development. It's not through a housing funding source at all. It's an income tax program. It's been around for about 30 years. It's survived, I think, all this time because it's a credit program rather than an allocated resource. And it benefits those who have wealth as well as those who don't. So in Massachusetts, the minimum project size to apply to this source is 20 units. So that is a driver of scale. So Sunderland's request for 18 units would have fallen below and would have made this source not accessible to the developer for that property. The second largest source is Massachusetts Companion Program, which is state tax credits. You can't apply for these unless you apply for these, the federal ones. So again, you start to really compromise where you can look for money if you're below this threshold. The state also has bond funding, a number of what are called soft debt sources, where they make you a loan, but the loan is deferred. And as long as you're in compliance, you don't have to repay it. The third largest source is permanent debt. So if your property has enough cash flow at the end of each month or each year, you can support a mortgage, basically a repayable loan. The fourth source is local funds, such as CPA, Community Preservation Act, and Community Development Block Grant, or tax incentive financing that some communities have. And the last source, and this is by category, I think, is other private sources, such as foundations or other private funding programs. Why are local funds critically important? It's interesting because local funds usually make up a very small percentage of the total pot, the total cost for affordable housing development. I would say anywhere from 1 to 20%, usually coming in at 2 to 5% of the total cost. However, they're often the first money in. And so they're committed a little bit on risk by the community. They usually commit the money in the form of an award letter. They don't give you the cash until the project's actually going to be built, so it's not super high risk. But they're taking a chance to say, we'll put money in, assuming this project can raise all of the other money that's needed. So it becomes critical when you're trying to leverage other larger sources, primarily from the state. Commitment of local funds shows the state as they go to make these funding awards, which are very competitive, that a community supports a particular project. In some cases, the state requires the community to put in money. In small towns that don't have much available, they're not as insistent, but we try to never go into the state without some show of support, really kind of tangible support from the community, whether it's cash, DPW labor, a special zoning consideration, piece of property, something that says the community is really behind this project. The fourth element is that you need an interested developer who's not only interested and willing, but is also able to have the capacity to do the job. So municipal and volunteer groups are not equipped to develop affordable housing. I have not seen any of them be successful at it in small towns that are typically understaffed in the most basic ways to begin with. And what folks should know is there is a shortage of affordable housing developers in Western Mass relative to demand. So there are more communities asking nonprofit developers and private developers to create affordable housing than there are people to do the work. There are fewer private affordable housing developers here many fewer than in Eastern Massachusetts, partly due to lower housing values and rents. And the scale of development in rural areas means that nonprofit developers are living on small margins and likely to have small, limited staff capacity. So the market, the sparse, settled nature, the scale of development all kind of come together to mean that, it's a tough nut to crack to have a ready, willing, and able developer for when a community has a project that it wants to do. So I wanted to give an example from Erving. So Erving has a wonderful site. It's large. It's on public water and sewer. It's directly adjacent to a new senior center, directly near a new library. The town did a market study to produce 40 to 60 units of senior housing on this site. Town published the request for proposals seeking a developer, and they got no responses. So in this case, we have some of the really important ingredients. We've got the infrastructure in place, we've got the site, we've got the patient site owner, we've got the local support, and nobody to develop it because there was not an interested developer with capacity at the time that that RFP was published. So it's a little bit of a cautionary tale to communities. I think sometimes there's an idea that if you're offering a free property, land or building, of course, there will be many people who will be enticed to come forward and build on it. And it's simply not necessarily the case. And so before doing the work of a big RFP process, I would be putting out feelers to likely developers to see, do they have time? Do they have interest? What kind of terms would they need to make it work for them? Realistic timeline and tenacity. So how long does the process really take? I think it's important to have a realistic expectation of the timeline and have allies, our local champions, that are prepared to stay the course and not discouraged after 2 or 3 years because it's going to take longer than that. So we're going to give a few examples of timelines. This is from Westhampton Woods Phase 1 in Goshen. Paul, I don't know if you would just want to quickly walk us through this, sequence.
Yeah, I can. I tried to find, that was a long time ago and it was actually before I worked here, but I know a little bit about what happened. And what I've heard and read was that it was in the mid 1990s when, so this says 7 years, but that might actually be a little lean compared to the very first notion of senior housing. In the mid 1990s, there was a community group that met at the Westhampton Congregational Church, and they identified a need for senior housing. And I understand, legend has it, that they went through some various efforts to get a developer interested. and eventually contacted Hilltown CDC. Hilltown was able to include in a community development block grant regional application some funding for planning work, if I'm remembering this right. Then as part of that process and going on from there, local volunteers looked for land. This slide says more than 60 parcels, and from what I've heard, it may have been a lot more than 60 parcels. Some people have said something like 100. There was one local gentleman who was probably in his 70s at the time, who actually went knocking on doors of local landowners who owned farmland or woodlands, and he eventually convinced a woman who owned farmland that to sell this farmland for senior housing would be in keeping with the wishes or the personality of her grandfather, who had originally settled the land a long time before. She was an elderly woman herself. And he also promised that there would be a plaque in honor of the grandfather in the community room that would be built as part of the project. So that takes us up into the early 2000s. And then the process from there is a little hazy for me, but I know that a comprehensive permit was granted in 2004, and at least an initial application to the Mass Housing Partnership, I believe, was submitted also in 2004. Construction took place in 2005, and people moved in January and February of 2006. And right after that, that's when I joined the staff here. So I got to sort of work with the initial residents.
Right. So one interesting theme is that I see is, there was, I believe the woman whose land this was actually on the committee, the Westhampton Senior Housing Planning Committee. And in the case of Sunderland as well, it was an elderly woman who was selling her property, who kind of connected with the town and said, I'd really like to see, I support the idea of senior housing. So there's some kind of positive nexus with your elders in your town, who are often stewards of resources like properties and land. Do you mind if I do this one, Paul? I'm gonna
Sure.
mush, so we have time for questions.
Okay.
So in Goshen, it's 10 units, 2 4-unit properties in a duplex. Interest began in the 1990s, but nobody really did anything concrete. And then when the town appointed a dedicated committee, the Goshen Elder Housing Study Committee, and they got some planning money, things started to rock and roll a little bit. One site was under contract, but then terms couldn't be negotiated. The final site selected had a variety of complexities. And from that initial planning study up through the move-in of people was an 8-year process. Oop. Lorin.
All I can say is if you weren't eligible for senior housing when you start, you probably are by the time you're done. So we did have a project in the 90s that fizzled out, but this particular project, again, we started in 2013-14. We bought the property, the town bought the property pretty much on spec, hoping that it would work, as I had mentioned before. The committee was appointed in 2014. Again, we hired consultants for the feasibility of site feasibility and for the market study in 2015. Opened our RFP in 2017, and we're very relieved to have a developer on board, because then basically the burden sort of shifted to them, and we were now supporting their work and sort of shepherding through the town. took us, another 2 years to get through the zoning permit, to get all the pre-development work and permitting and then go through the zoning hearing. But, finally that happened, and now, we're sort of on track for a 2022 move-in. And there you go, 9 years and before you know it. So, I think you really do have to plan to stick with it. I don't think it's ever fast. And, there's so many pieces to it. And, you're kind of bringing people along the whole time. And I would say for us, the selectmen were behind it from the beginning. The CPA was very determined to try to have some senior housing. And in general, the town was behind the concept of having senior housing. And it's still a complicated and long process.
Thank you, Lorin. So tools that are available for small and rural towns to develop affordable senior housing include local volunteers, as we've been talking about, and really there will always be someone who thinks it's a bad idea, no matter what it is. So you want local voices of support. Money is important for planning and pre-development, and rural towns have very little of discretionary resources. So we find usually it's CPA or CDBG are the most likely sources that towns use. Local knowledge of land and properties, because site selection is so critical. In Goshen, the man that Paul referred to, he went door to door knocking to try to find a property. Professional expertise, you can look to the regional planning agencies, local affordable housing developers like the CDCs, local other private developers or builders in your home community. Town-owned property is, I would say, more often the exception than the rule. Often town surplus property is, I put white elephant, because often what towns have in surplus are things that they have in surplus because they're too expensive to redevelop. And so the idea that those would then make really good affordable housing isn't always true. Sometimes it works, but often it doesn't work from a financial perspective. So I hesitate to get locked into properties that are owned by the municipality. Market data is another really important tool from the census, definitely from market studies, and understanding that most rural seniors move to senior housing based on life circumstances, the death of a spouse, health problems, losing the ability to drive, rather than because they happen to be a certain age or a certain income. Surveys of residents can be useful tools to understand and to demonstrate demand, but I would look at this data very critically, kind of like our early poll. It's easy for people to say they want it, they like it. It's a very different thing for someone who owns their own house to kind of sell it, pick up, and move into senior housing. And so it's a really careful look at who's really going to be ready to relocate and move into this housing should it be provided. That's the end, so we can do questions.
Yep. That was fantastic, really comprehensive. We have had a number of questions, and I'm hoping people will chime in more as they remember, because it's always a challenge to do these at the end, but that was a lot of material. So one of them came up with one, you mentioned sort of sources of fundings. In terms of funding available to actually acquire the land, what
Sure.
is a normal source for that?
Sure. So if the land is being acquired by the developer, say a nonprofit like Valley, we would look to, there's an agency called CDAC, which is a quasi-public state agency that has acquisition financing specifically for nonprofits to buy land to develop affordable housing. So that is the source that we would look to. More often, we try to defer the actual purchase date as long as possible, so we don't have all those holding costs and interest costs. So if we can, we'll set up a very long-term option or purchase and sales agreement so that we're deferring the point in time when we need to own the property. In the case of Sunderland, where the town went ahead and bought this property on spec, as Lorin said, they use Community Preservation Act funds. So Community Preservation Act funds can be used, community development block grant funds can be used. I've seen towns marry sometimes conservation funds with affordable housing funds. So they'll buy a big parcel and some of it will get conserved and then the frontage will get carved off for affordable housing. So there's a number of potentials.
Yep. We're having a couple questions about what about this process is specific to senior housing, both in terms of the design of the project,
Yep.
and also just the development process. Is there, you know, what's the difference between senior housing and any other affordable or mixed income housing?
Sure. Well, the state has made it a requirement that you have supportive services specifically for senior housing. They don't require it for other types of housing necessarily. So again, that kind of ropes back to a scale issue. How do you have a project that has enough revenue or partner with social service agencies so that you can provide a social service package? In terms of development, we always want it to be as handicapped accessible as possible. So you would never do second story units. I know they used to be done in the day, but nowadays you will not get funded for second story units with stairs. Absolutely not. So Goshen and Westhampton are all ground level, kind of ranch style properties. The Sunderland multifamily building will be served by an elevator. All of the bathrooms will have roll-in showers. So there are things that you look at to make it as usable for people who might have mobility or sensory impairments as possible. Size of units. So we pretty much build 1 bedrooms, occasional 2 bedrooms. Again, it's the death of a spouse is a causal event for many seniors to relocate from their home into senior housing. So they're going to come in 1s primarily, sometimes 2s, but mostly 1s. So you wouldn't be building a lot of 2 and 3 bedroom units in senior housing, whereas you might be in family housing. And then the way that you look at market, the issues I was talking about is, you know, really understanding how many of this big, you know, you can look at your town and say, gosh, we've got, you know, 800 senior households that are income eligible. Surely, you know, they would rent up this many units, but I would be more conservative because it means people selling houses that they've already paid off. So it's a little bit of a different equation, I think, than family housing.
I don't know if you can you hear me? We had a question probably for Lorin about what was the makeup of the committee in Sunderland? You know, who participated and what would you recommend?
So we had, I was the chair and I do have a background in design and I've also chaired other committees in town. This is actually my 3rd building committee. We had someone from the Historic Commission who's also an architect. I would say if you can have someone who is familiar with architecture or the building trades, that's always a plus. I've found that on every building committee I've been on. Again, we had 3 abutters, one with a background in real estate, which was helpful. One with a background in development and as a developer, which was helpful. We had someone with kind of municipal background and we had someone from the Board of Selectmen. And again, I think in this particular case, having so many abutters when, you know, was really going to have an impact on abutters, I think was pretty critical, particularly in the early stages.
Yeah.
Because they could go back and talk to their neighbors. And some of the abutters were from actually a condominium group that is close by. And, you know, that's a group that, you know, where there's a structure of, you know, obviously a board, and it was just very, very helpful. And we didn't, you know, it wasn't even me going to people, it was people going to their own neighbors, which I just think in a small town always works better.
There's a question saying, are tax incentives as available for family housing? But I think you're actually talking about tax credits, right, Laura, not tax incentives.
Well, there's both. So yes, I would say they're even more available for family housing in the case of the low-income housing tax credit program. Our state has a higher priority for family housing than senior housing. Doesn't mean they don't fund senior housing, but they don't fund as much of it. The tax incentive financing is something that a local municipality could offer, and they would set up their own terms for how that would work. And it usually has to do with affordable units. It doesn't usually discriminate between family or senior units.
Yeah. This is a question that a term that I don't think most people think about, but I'd love you to talk about this. Paul responded as well, which is prevailing wages versus not prevailing wages. What is that? When does that come into play?
Sure.
When can you not do that?
Right. So prevailing wages come into play when you are working on public property. So when you are a housing authority, which is a public entity developing public housing, you need to pay a certain wage rate that's stipulated by the state, sometimes by the federal, depending on your sources. You also need to go through public bidding, which is a prescriptive type of bidding. As a private nonprofit developer, when we work on a property that we control, we are not bound by prevailing wage requirements, and we're not bound by public bid requirements. We still do a bid process to get good pricing, but it's not the same as a public bid process. The common lore is that prevailing wages can add as much as 25 to 30% of cost onto a project. So when towns are building schools and libraries and police stations, they're looking at that very expensive per square foot kind of cost. So when you have a choice about whether to build under prevailing wages or not, there is a financial incentive to not do it. And so the property that Sunderland owns, the nonprofit developer has an option to purchase it, and that option will be exercised right before construction. So that's when the property will transfer over. So the construction itself will not be under prevailing wages.
Oh, another prevailing wage question, and I'm trying to oh, well, never mind. I'm going to skip that one. What are the types of support services needed for senior housing, and where do the funds for that come from? I mean, I know there's like MRVP plus, et cetera.
Great question. So the type of housing that we illustrated here today is independent senior living. It's not assisted senior housing. So to get up to assisted senior housing, which is a nurse is on staff, you're providing 24/7 services, you would need, I would think, at least 60 units. You need a much larger scale.
Yeah.
So most small towns that's not what they're trying to do. They're basically trying to have independent senior housing and bring in as much support as they can. So Meals on Wheels, congregate meals, local health center coming in and helping with meds, flu clinics, whatever can be brought from the community in, van transportation into the project. So a lot of the payment is happening because you have community-based providers who are now coming to your property and partnering with you. Some of the payment has to come from the operating budget itself, but the operating budget can only carry so much. So the state wants you to have a resident services coordinator on site. So it's a point person who can really help residents find those linkages with medical supports, transportation supports, social service supports. And often that gets carried on the back of the operating budget. Your project has to be up to a certain size to do that. In the case of Hilltown CDC, they have a tenant services coordinator who is serving multiple scattered site small projects. So that's the other potential method to try to carry the cost of having that professional work with your residents.
And then there was another question that I think is of interest, which is, given that these are 40B that only requires 25% affordable,
Yep.
what are your thoughts about the market or market rate, and particularly outside of Boston, given that sometimes the difference between the market rate rents and the affordable rents is not that extreme? So
Right.
how do you navigate all that?
We don't find that in terms of when you're talking about rental housing, that the rents that you can charge, the actual market rents, are high enough to cover the cost of building the unit.
Well,
in Western Mass. When you get into a condo market, like some of the 55 and over condo developments, sometimes they are very expensive. And so in a case like that, you might be able to mix together some affordable condos. This is where I've seen the mix, some affordable condos with some market rate condos, because people are selling their homes. They have this large chunk of equity that they can put into a senior housing condo.
great. And then I think we'll probably wrap with this question, which is about lease up. I'm personally interested in the local preference issue, if this is something that's actually intended to kind of serve a region.
Yeah.
And how quickly did the lease up go? How challenging was it to find qualified applicants, et cetera?
Well, in the case of Sunderland, the jury's out because we haven't leased it up yet. Paul, do you want to talk to this? Because you've done a couple of local preference projects in rural towns, and it's been a tricky process.
Yeah, it really, you were speaking earlier about how, you know, a lot of people expressed interest, but not necessarily a lot of people are going to move in. And you also have the problem that when you're trying to create enough scale, you're creating a situation where you probably need people from outside the community to fill all the units, at least initially. Now, over time, as more people age and perhaps there's some growth in the community, you might have more local people moving in, and it's great to have that resource there. If the question was just, you know, how long does it take to lease up? We've had really good success with kind of pre-qualifying people basically during the construction process, and when the project is ready for move-in, the units are all occupied within 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
What's been more challenging is who are those occupants going to be? In Goshen, we had 70, I think it's the state will let you do 70% local preference. But what that means is 70% of the people can be in a local preference lottery. And you also need to balance the local preference lottery with minority people, representing the percentage of minority people who live in the larger region. So what happened in Goshen was when it came right down to it, there were only 2 or 3 income qualified people who were local and were interested in moving in and were in the local preference lottery. One of those people turned out to be offered a unit and turned it down. I believe it was a situation where both spouses were still alive, and they decided to stay in their current situation a while longer. And then there was one other local person who would have been qualified and got beat out in the lottery by a minority person. And the town was quite upset that no local people were moving in. What happened was within a year, the minority person moved out and the other local person was next on the waiting list to move in. So that was how the lottery worked. I'm not sure if that's clear, if people have questions about that.
So in terms of who moves in terms of market, what we find in small towns in Western Mass is there are not people flooding from urban areas as they age to live into tiny towns. So your market really is folks who are local, like they've grown up there, their family is there, people from other surrounding equally small rural towns. Like in Goshen, people move from Chesterfield and Williamsburg and Westhampton, and you know, it's regional, but it's the same type of environment. And then parents of folks who live in your town. So where you have the adult children are living in Goshen and mom is living in Minnesota, and would be relocated to be near to family. So I think those are kind of the markets that you're looking at. The concept that people are flooding from, urban areas to come to the sticks where there's very little transportation or services in their golden years is a false perception. So you really are serving a local market, whether it's just your town or the other little towns that are around your town.
Yeah, I want to confirm that, because in Goshen, in spite of the fact that there were no town residents in the initial lease up, there was a gentleman who moved in who was a local contractor from the next town over. He had built the barn next door to the project. There was someone from the next town over who brought her mother up from Arizona. And there were a number of cases like that. There was someone who was a member who lived in another town, but was a member of the church that had sold the land to the project developer. So I'd say half of the people who moved in, at least, could be considered local people. It's just if you were one of the town officials who was really, wanting to be able to say that, oh, we served, 7 Goshen residents, that turned out not to be true.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time. This was so comprehensive and fantastic, and I hope everyone gets your contact information so they can pepper you with questions later. So I'm going to we'll probably close it out, and I'll turn it over to Katie to just wrap us here.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This was really fantastic. Just a reminder, we'll have the recording up on the toolbox, and hopefully I can follow up with Laura, Lorin, and Paul's emails if you need to reach out and follow up on any questions from the presentations. And then I just wanted to note, next week we're taking a break from the Western Mass Conference, and we'll reconvene on November 5th. We have Don Bianchi of MACDC, who will be leading a discussion with a few others on distressed and abandoned properties. So we hope to see you then. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.